So thank you very much indeed. Thanks to Felix and the team for the opportunity to chair this panel. He said it would be a tremendous opportunity. I think it might be termed an insurmountable opportunity to moderate this particular group of people. You can see they're already relishing their time with the microphone. So this whole area, whether you choose to call it personalized, precision, or as George in the break called it, rational medicine, is, I think, going to be the new era in medicine, But I wrote down something that was on one of Anu's slides, which was, no force can stop something whose time has come. But actually, I see a number of forces ranged against personalized precision, rational medicine that we're going to talk about. But let me just introduce the panel first of all. So George to my left, I remember 20 years ago, sorry George, you were talking about RX, DX, IX, GX, there were probably some other X's that we could talk about, how they were all going to come together in this new era. So George is one of those people who, if you listen to what he says today, just write it down and you'll expect it to happen in about 20 years' time. He's also somebody I think of as bringing tomorrow's problems to us today. Some of the forecasts he makes, I'm afraid, are very, whether they're about good things or whether they're about challenges, are pretty effective. Mene, who's on the far side of this panel, is bringing, I think, fresh aspiration and vision to AstraZeneca, one of the UK's leading pharmaceutical companies, and is actually thinking about these very same things, about how diagnostics, therapeutics, and informatics might come together to solve tomorrow's problems. So that's Mene. And of course, AstraZeneca is building a tremendous facility here in Cambridge, so he may have some comments about the interface between academia and industry. And Rick Klausner, who's to Mene's right here, has been on a long and still continuing journey from having headed the NCI, National Cancer Institute in the US, to a whole host of entrepreneurial ventures, which he might give us some examples of. And that journey, I think, is one that's been fascinating to watch and will continue for many years to come. Anu now needs no introduction, but as you can see, she's brought this dedication to precision medicine to India and to the whole process of democratizing the capabilities of genomics. So I'm going to ask each one of the panelists, firstly, just to make a very brief statement about what they see as most exciting in this new era of precision or personalized medicine. By the way, I'm going to discourage them from making debate about terminology here. Let's sweep it all into a big bucket called precision or personalized medicine. What excites them the most about this? And we'll go, George, if we may, from you onwards. And then we'll circle back and then talk about what forces might stop something whose time has come, and how can we grapple with some of the major issues, whether they be reimbursement or ethics or technology or industry. And then we're going to open up to you folks with your ideas, actually. And let me just prime you with this. I'd love questions that say, how would it be if? What if we did this? Because what we need now is fresh thinking with some of the challenges that are coming forward. So, George, what gets you out of bed in the morning with regard to this subject?
Well, first of all, I can't resist your temptation that we're deemed to be unruly, so I will actually make one semantic comment, and that is the fact that I've trained a large dog to bite anyone who uses the word personalized medicine. I can live with precision medicine, I can live with rational medicine, but we're a long way from personalized medicine. But marginal humor aside, I think it's clearly such a multidimensional topic, but I think the two things that excite me most are the power of contemporary molecular biology and biomarkers, not yet fully realized, to play a crucial role in predicting therapeutic response. And I think that's as much an economic imperative as it is a clinical imperative, particularly when we get into the realms of very high-cost therapeutics in areas like oncology and so forth. The other one is given the fact that so much is also dependent upon what happens, as you said in your elegant summary, what happens in the environment and behavior, the whole issue of the ability to track and analyze personal behaviors now that impact the things such as medication compliance, early detection of disease relapse outside of clinical settings and so forth. So those are the utilization of sensor technologies and so forth. So it's a slightly broader definition, but those are two which rank very high on my list.
Anu.
I guess for me, what excites me is that the fact that consumers are waking up to this fact that they can contribute. But I think the challenge always will be how do we actually get all the data that we really want from everybody without having the necessary regulatory and other issues in terms of saying how do you transfer health data from one system to another? How do you actually get consumer data standardized across platforms, right? So you have lots of Fitbits and various other things. Are they all standardized and certain things like that? So I think it's more about saying, can we get to a point where all the information that we get is reasonably regulated so that the information you get out of that, so garbage in, garbage out. So if you get that in nicely, then you get a better decision systems.
And we'll return to this question of how all of that data comes together, I think, in discussion. Rick, what excites you about this field?
There's three things that excite me right now about this field. I'll just illustrate it by three projects I'm involved with. I will start off by saying that I'm a big fan of George's dog. We can come back to that. It's all about science. And when we get the science right, the precision or personal or everything falls out of that. It's the right description, the right mechanism, the right intervention. I think the three things that excite me most of what's going on that I've been able to be involved in, one is the real advent of cell-based therapy. I think in the last couple of years, this remarkable transformation of oncology, not just in general IO, but I think, of course I was involved in it, the cell-based CAR T-cell therapy, because it's the first time that we're going to use cells successfully. There's been lots of gene therapy and stuff like that, but in terms of the success, these are immune stem cells. So it's our first real stem cell therapy. And I really do believe, we have to wait longer, that we are largely curing people. This is single dose curative therapy. Probably Bill Hazelton has heard me for 40 years talking about cancer. I never use the word cure. Yes, I talked about our cure of acute lymphocytic leukemia in the 50s and 60s, but I never used it, and I find myself finally using it. It is absolutely extraordinary. Interestingly, to this idea of endlessly dividing things by thinking if we look with the right spotlight as genomics, proteomics, everything, it was largely irrelevant in CAR T-cell therapy. I don't care if they were germ cell, diffuse large cell lymphoma. I didn't care what their genetics was, not to be overly negative about this, but the reality is, what I think we want to do as scientists and physicians is actually not complicate medicine any more than it absolutely requires to be complicated. There's no particular value in the imagination of individualizing everything. The value is getting it right. And I think that's a really interesting thing that's going on with immuno-oncology. It is going in some ways somewhat orthogonally to the genomic obsession in personalized medicine in oncology, and where we're actually seeing cures, which has so far eluded us largely with molecularly targeted therapy. So that's the one area, this new cell-based therapy. The next thing is new ways of detecting things. And I started a company 2 years ago called Grail, after the Holy Grail, which I told people was because it was never found. So don't get too excited. And that is, it emerged from an incredible, if I can just take 2 more minutes, brief observation, looking at blood tests of women that were using an amazing new molecular diagnostic called non-invasive prenatal testing, where you were able to look at the chromosomal structure of the fetus by that small fraction of fetal DNA that leaked into the maternal circulation. And at the point of about 200,000 of these tests have been done, the pathologist who was looking at it, I knew, and she said she had a collection of 15 weird results. And she showed it to me and wanted to know what this was. And, you know, because when you're an oncologist, everything's cancer, right? So it's, you know, if you're, you know, a hammer, everything's a nail. So I said, well, you know, these women have cancer. And they all did. They didn't know it. They all did. And so that was the start of Grail. And I will tell you is that it really looks, this will be presented at the AACR right now. I think we really can detect pan-cancer in asymptomatic people with close to 100% specificity. We still have to work out exactly what the sensitivity is. This is really going to, I think, as adopted, dramatically change the face and how we think about cancer. I mean, think about cancer as an early stage disease. All of this, most of what we've worried about starts going away. So that's the second thing that excites me. And the third is, I think, the ability to begin to measure using this ubiquitous medical tool, the cell phone, to actually measure continuous neural function, not behavior, but neural function. And maybe I'll talk about that later. That's the third thing that gets me up in the morning. And opening up, finally, for the first time, the ability to apply to the brain a meaningful, objective laboratory, which we've never had.
And as Rick knows, I sit on the board of a company that's invested in 2 out of those 3 things, and now we're going to have to look, I think, at the third. Many.
So that, thanks, and I think that what I think you're hearing from everyone is that precision medicine isn't the future; it's actually here and now. And actually, we were talking in the break about the talk that the first time you heard me speak in Crete about something that was called the 5 R's framework. This is a framework that we set up when I first joined AstraZeneca, and the 5 R's, which I won't go into, 3 of them relate very specifically to precision medicine. The first one is right target. When you work on any biology or drug discovery program, how well do you understand the target and the pathway that you're working on? How can you validate it genetically or invalidate it genetically, preferably in humans, but also in animals? The third of the 5 R's is right patient. So defining the patient population that is most likely to respond to modulation of that particular target or pathway. Because if you can't get a beneficial effect in that discrete patient population, you're not going to get it in any broader population. And then the 5th of the 5 R's is right commercial. And by right commercial, I don't mean, is it going to be a billion-dollar blockbuster drug? I mean, define the value proposition. Why a patient, a physician, or most importantly, a payer would actually want to reimburse and ultimately prescribe that medicine. And if you can get those 3 things right, what you do is you increase the probability of success. Now, when I gave that talk, AstraZeneca's R&D productivity was at around 4%. So that meant that for every project we started, from GLP tox to launch, we were failing 96% of the time. 96%, so you have to be quite resilient as an R&D scientist in industry. The industry average at that time, this is between 2005 and 2010, was 5% success rate. So we were lousy, but actually the whole industry is pretty lousy. We've now moved up. We did a similar analysis, which is published in Nature Reviews early this year. Our success rate now, following the 5R framework, has gone up to almost 20%. And the industry has actually gone from 5% to 4%. Now, I'm not saying that we've become successful because of the 5 R's, but what I do think is this focus on understanding the pathways and the targets that you work on, defining the patient population, understanding what the endpoints need to be and why anyone will reimburse are important in ultimately improving your probability of success. And what I think is really exciting is the progress that we've seen in areas like oncology, where we are for the first time starting to talk about cure. It's still unfortunately rare. Even immuno-oncology, most patients don't respond, and most patients, even after they have responded, progress. But we're starting to see this progress not just in cancer, but also in respiratory disease, in cardiovascular, metabolic, renal disease, and other diseases as well. So precision medicine is not just here to stay, it's here to stay and move beyond oncology, moving into other therapy areas. I'm a neuroscientist by training. I'm seeing some really exciting progress actually in the area of neuroscience, in Huntington's disease and diseases like SMA, where we're seeing tremendous progress. And I think what Richard finished with, which is this idea of being able to detect tumor progression, cancer, and then ultimately tumor progression and potentially resistance using blood tests is incredibly, incredibly important in terms of patient welfare, patient care, and ultimately optimizing treatment regimens. We have a drug which is probably the prototypical example for me of a precision medicine called Tagrisso. It's for a small subset of EGFR positive lung cancer. It went from first in man to launch in less than 3 years. And we can now monitor progression on Tagrisso of patients using a blood test. We can actually detect whether they have the appropriate mutation using a blood test, and we can also measure progression of disease or emergence of resistance using a blood test as well. It's incredibly, incredibly powerful, and hopefully the world that medicine is evolving to.
So that gives you a bit of a smorgasbord, if you like, of the possibilities here. But I do want us to return to the forces that could stop something whose time has come, right? Because I think already they will have been popping up in your mind. But let's start, George, with you, right? So you have painted a picture of a tsunami of information, genomic information, proteomic information, microbiomic information, and then all of this information that Rick is going to extract from my cell phone and your cell phone, right? I mean, how do you bring this together? Can you see how that information is going to get integrated and actually utilized?
No. Oh. I mean, it is one of the grand challenges by definition, but because it starts at the most proximal level, do we even have sufficiently standardized data sets? So the whole question of this sort of siloed partition of data, so whether it be at the molecular level, the clinical level, or capturing behaviors to the outside, unless you've actually, by definition, unless you've actually got an agreed set of database standards for interoperability and integration. But so those are very obvious, if not banal parameters, but on top of it, you've then got, and obviously this will vary whether you're in a national health service like the UK or certain other European nations versus the US, how are you actually going to get reimbursed for the capture of that information? It's in the molecular diagnostics arena, in oncology, it's still problematic. You're constantly fighting with the insurers to actually get reimbursement for what is already a very well-established test for Mr. or Mrs. Jones, because they've got the expression of a definitive molecular marker which indicates they would respond to a particular oncology drug, and yet probably a third of your patients you're actually having to spend time fighting the insurers because they still deem it to be experimental. But I think that's also a prelude to another transition to not just data which is coming from randomized clinical trials, and I think we're going to have to look at randomized clinical trials in an area in which we can molecularly stratify patients to entirely new clinical trial designs like Bayesian adaptive trials. But I think the bigger issue is that insurers, quite appropriately at one level, are asking for what has come to be known colloquially as real-world evidence. Namely, what is the performance of this drug, this diagnostic, this intervention in the framework of the delivery of healthcare? And I think that will drive data standards, it will drive integration, but it is going to be a long road. And I mean, even the most conservative estimates indicate that we're talking about zottabytes, namely 10 to the 21 data sets that we will have to be beginning to plan for. And frankly, there is not the infrastructure in place to handle that. I mean, there are very optimistic dimensions about cloud computing that apply here, but unless we actually get capture of data correctly, standardized, validated data, we will still be languishing in the siloed fragmentation that we're facing today. But it is the trajectory that must be followed. And one last point about the beast on the hip or the beast on the wrist. I think this is going to be a very fascinating area. We're deeply involved in digital psychiatry. I hope there are no psychiatrists in the audience because I'm about to defame them. It is the most imprecise of the clinical disciplines. And yet there are a number of fascinating behavioral elements. People are much more prepared to give up definitive information about themselves to a computer as opposed to a person. The other issue is the fact that if I'm running in to see Mrs. Jones, I can't barely remember what happened last month because you've had to see too many people. But the computer can actually play back to them the exact same question that was asked, either with the exact tonality or in a slightly different context. And what you're doing is to measure, the computer is measuring microsaccade movements that we don't pick up, facial measure, expressions, change in tonality and tone, and there's a whole arena here which is going to be powerfully important, not just in psychiatry, but judging how people are responding to their medicines at large. So another large data set.
And it was interesting, some of you may have seen in the papers over the weekend, a group of people from Imperial College can tell whether someone is pregnant from their tweets. I mean, presumably not reading the tweet that says, "Hello, everybody, I'm pregnant." But they immediately said, but we are very conscious of the fact that this could be abused, right? So we are also entering an era not only of collecting information, but defending information.
Well, it's the famous case of the young woman who was pregnant and was looking up websites for diapers, and that was then showing up on her father's website. And he wanted to find out what was going on.
So, but one of the points you made is reimbursement. So I'm going to turn to Rick, because you've been thinking about this, Rick. I mean, whether you're talking about an extremely expensive CAR T therapy, or whether you're talking about a test which gets an early detection of cancer, or I'm sure you haven't got yet to the reimbursement stage at Mindstrong. But how do we get over this? Because even some of the things that we know work today aren't getting paid for by the health system.
Well, I think there's several aspects of that. One is I think we do need to really, in a serious way, move to value-based payment. I think when you do that, the ability to, even as NICE has done an analysis of CAR T cells and came up with a projected price that was more than twice what has been proposed in the States. And it's because of the value. And so, you know, the reality is we've paid a lot for very little value for a long time. And we may be excited about all these things, but, you know, so the one, without going too much into what we paid for in the past, I think we ought to hold ourselves to a much higher standard than we have as a medical community about the value of what we're selling to people, and be willing to negotiate with society in general about a reimbursement that's based upon the value. Hard to do, and it's really, but I think that's one thing. But the second thing is this issue of precision medicine. Precision medicine is, I think without exception, based upon measurement. Modern science-based medicine is all based upon measuring the right things, measuring them accurately, and using them. And the fundamental problem we have about that is that the measurement side of precision medicine, of modern medicine, is the stepchild of drugs or products where you can make a lot of money, and somehow the how to capture the value that the measurement provides to the intervention, I think is an enormous challenge in driving what has always been and remains the driver of precision, which is measurement science. But you know, diagnostics is not a great business.
But let me push back then, right? Because I used to run a diagnostics company. It was very clear how different people thought about the price of diagnostics, unless you happen to have a completely unique diagnostic, which fortunately this company did. But most of the time they say, what do you mean $15, $20? I've got lots of tests that I can run for $5, right? How do we get into the mind of the payers or society in general? Exactly what you say, the measurement is the first and often most highly valued step.
Well, of course, one aspect is the fact that, as Manny is talking about, there's more and more drugs whose approval is tied to a measurement. I think that's a really interesting path to a demonstration of the need for shared value. Beyond
So you want money to pay for it?
Well, he's not paying for it.
We do actually. I mean, it's not a problem if we pay for it. It becomes part of the value proposition. It doesn't actually matter. I think the key is that, and actually what I do think will happen is that the diagnostics will start to become, with the advent of next generation sequencing diagnostics, more panels rather than individual genes. And so you'll be able to do a diagnosis with a panel of where you're measuring across a number of different potential genetic drivers in cancer, for example, and then as a consequence pick the right drug. So it'll become more routine, I think, because right now you do a BRCA test or you do an EGFR test.
Right.
And I do think it'll become easier, and when it becomes a blood test, I think it'll become quicker as well.
But when those panels
Yes.
indicate several drugs from several different companies,
It
are
does-
they still going to pay for those tests?
Well, I think at that stage, I think then the diagnostic itself will be being paid for, and then the physician will be choosing the appropriate drug for the appropriate patient.
Yeah, I
So
think
you
we
should
need
be
to
lobbying for that.
Yeah, I think
we
we
are-
need to
yeah,
switch
absolutely.
viewing these diagnostics as companion diagnostics
Yeah.
to the fact that the drugs are companion therapeutics. Because the central thing is what you measure that's how you make decisions in medicine, is based upon appropriate measurement, and then you choose. And there's a really interesting question whether the future is going to be physicians writing prescriptions for drugs or writing prescriptions for a condition. That's already happened with coagulation. Physicians more and more don't write a drug for an anticoagulant. They write a drug to anticoagulate. I think that may well be what's in the future of psychiatry and behavioral health, that you basically, if you have a real diagnostic that said this person has depression of a certain sort, that you write a prescription for the medical treatment of depression, not a drug.
And indeed, the prescription may be you need to do these following tests to figure out whether you have diabetes type A, B, C, or D. But Anu, you must be thinking about some of this conversation. It's all very well for it to take place in Cambridge or in New York or whatever, but does this seem realistic in a country like India, and can this be democratized?
Absolutely. So I would say that we are getting to a point where even a whole genome sequence will be $100, right? So if you think about that, I think even the states should think about saying do you create a genome or whatever, that card for somebody, because that sort of changes how everybody is going to, whether it is the insurance companies paying for it, whether it is the state paying for it, whether it's your employer paying for it, and that reduces some of the risk that is underlying all of these, right? So you're looking at a lot of systems that are going to pay for something like that. And I think that's the challenge, right? You don't want to make it dependent on one consumer paying for it. So if it is possible that they can all pay for it, you create a card, I think you have reduced some of that risk in that process. The second risk, I think, which is there today, is to say, will it happen in countries like India? I think it is more likely to happen in a country like India because we don't have, it's like leapfrogging, we don't have that infrastructure in between. So it's easier for us to go there than for countries that already have that infrastructure, because how do you get over those systems?
Just a bit like the cell phone, you're saying.
Exactly.
Well, there'll be some leapfrog opportunities.
There is
Can
an
you give some
opportunity.
examples of how that might work?
So I'm saying, let's say, I remember the point when at GeneLogic, for instance, my previous company, we paid $12,000 per sample for creating a one data point, right? That has changed to a few cents. I'm just giving an example. So now it is possible for anybody, anyone to be able to say, I can actually sponsor something like this, right? So we are finding, for instance, in India, I think there are enough people who are saying, we'll be able to pay for something like that, right? So I'm saying that there is a possibility of someone saying, I'm going to pay for this because the overall ROI is going to be better for me. right? So what happened in telecom, we didn't have the infrastructure for us to have individual cell phones, in the 80s or anything. But suddenly, India is now one of the largest producers, or where the largest number of smartphones that are there. So I think that changes the way you're going to. So if everybody had, information about whether it's pharmacogenomics, whether it's something else, I'm just giving an example, and that was there on your phones.
So I think even if we get all of this right, and all the things we've been talking about, there's another looming gap, which is physician education.
That's the most difficult part.
I mean, so when we set up a new medical school, we essentially had 4 tenets: molecular medicine, engineering-based medicine, data-intensive computational medicine, and the last one was the most difficult of all: social recalibration of the expectation of the physician in healthcare delivery. Of course, the MD will continue to be important, but it will be much more linked to not only team-based medicine, so it will not necessarily be as hierarchical as it has been to date. But as we move increasingly to data-intensive medicine, we will actually need not only a new category of physician trained in these types of capabilities, we will also need an entire spectrum of new data scientists and people facile in machine intelligence and artificial intelligence to participate. In my generation, the reason most of us did biology or medicine is because we didn't have to do math, right? Now it's an entirely different perspective, but that educational gap is profound, both in the contemporary curriculum, yet alone as you would project it moving forward.
So let me ask you...
Can I just build on two points that have just been made? The first is the importance of the data that is associated with the genome. So I think, and George, I think you alluded to this at the beginning. It's one of the challenges that we're finding. We're trying to sequence right now 2 million genomes through various collaborations and clinical data sets that we have ourselves. And the biggest challenge when you're going out into sort of general populations is actually the associated medical record with the genome and making sure that it's accurate and well structured, because if it isn't, then actually the genome isn't very, very useful. And so that's something that has to get sorted out as you go into very disparate data sets and countries and regions where healthcare is very different. Marrying that up becomes quite important. So that's point one, and the second point has just eluded me. I'm going to come back to it when it comes to my mind. But that, I think, George, is a big challenge for us as we look at these big genomics initiatives.
Yeah. One last intervention. I'm going to turn to the audience for a couple of things. Go ahead.
But just before you open up, maybe I'll be a little contrarian here.
Please.
In this era where what George is asking for is more and more data. We want endless data, zettabytes of data on everyone. I would pose that perhaps the challenge for the next generation is not the AI machine learning challenge where the fairy dust allows you to learn to get wisdom out of endless amounts of data. Maybe it's just the opposite. Maybe what we want to strive for is to learn the minimum data set that gives us the biggest bang for the buck, the biggest Dali effect, or the biggest effect on the patient. I'm really concerned that we're all following now a 25-year fantasy, which is just more data, more data. And there is, I'm not questioning that there is value in large data sets, but actually, I've been impressed with how, frankly, hard that is. And even, Mene, if you get all those, well-oriented, compatible medical records, actually it turns out, if you never collected, I don't know how many of you look at medical records. Probably much of the useful information that we wish we had, you can't find it, no matter how well digitized that is. And it goes back to the question, is it big data or smart data? And I actually think this is a pressing question for us now, for the next generation. Is the answer that we don't have any ideas, but if we collect everything, something will come? This may be a problem, and it may be the barrier to acceptance.
I don't think that's a contrarian question, although posing a contrarian question, you forget I have a big dog.
That's right.
But I'm not afraid because I know he's back in Arizona.
But I would agree with you that as with all trends in science, you have the hype factor, and then you have a herd mentality that follows everything. But I think it is clearly, to use your appropriate term, what is going to be the most instructive minimal data set? Because clearly biology does run by rules.
Exactly.
But within that, we clearly do actually have to accept. So, for example, I could not recommend to my son or daughter that they basically become a pathologist or a radiologist relative to where we see machine intelligence, which can learn with vast numbers of images. Dermatology gets into the same area. But I think in other areas, we are at risk of just over-capturing data, which is of minimal value. And it's not just the fact that inadequate annotation into the medical record itself. I mean, there was a study the insurance industry used to actually have a pretty good record when they used to say, are your mother and father alive? Are your siblings alive? What did they die from? And so forth. And they had a pretty good actuarial analysis. There was a recent study from the University of Wisconsin that showed that 85% of medical records don't even have family history included in them.
Right. So let me give you an example. I was talking to somebody just this week who's working on sound-based data capture, not voice, but sound. The point he made was that if in an average consultation, a doctor and a patient may well exchange information that indeed never gets into the medical record, but to Rick's point, may be highly significant, maybe the one thing, and a skilled doctor will in fact spot that one thing, a less skilled doctor will not. I'm going to, now we're more than halfway through this, so I really am going to try and wrest control. The first thing in terms of audience or group participation, how many people are doctors or doctors in training? Thank you. How many are data scientists or computer scientists? Is anybody both a doctor and a data scientist? Okay. So I think we've just illustrated at the point, which is that we need to bring these worlds together in some way. But anybody in the audience, please, here's your opportunity to, we pose some pretty important challenges and barriers. You may have ideas about how to overcome them. Anybody who is a doctor in training,
one more category. Is there a social media billionaire in the audience?
Yes, is there, George would like to speak to you if you are a social media billionaire, because he has a wonderful, so does
I'd
Trevor
like to speak
Mundell,
if
by
you're
the way.
about to become a
You're all probably going to do that, right? So who would like to start with in terms of how to overcome this huge gap there is between medicine, if you like, and the computer and data science that we know will be part of the future? Please.
Hi, my name is Winnie. I am actually working on data, particularly in China. So I actually realized something that's very interesting that I think might be helpful for precision medicine. I'm saying it from a patient samples perspective. First of all, when my dad was diagnosed with lung cancer, unfortunately, he didn't actually have the T790M mutation. But what we have always wanted to do is to figure it out among all these clinical trials. There's always like 1 or 2 or 3% of the populations that are cured, for no matter what reason. And why can't pharmaceutical companies work together on these data and try to analyze a subset group of data and maybe use Grail's technology or MU's technology to figure it out why these patients got cured? And that is always the questions that we have, and that's why I started my company in China that's particularly working on collecting data and analyzing them. And the other thing that the Chinese are actually very good at is to having these knockoff drugs that they make themselves from a small pharmaceutical companies. I think AstraZeneca probably know a lot about that. That they created their own dose to use based on where the metastasis is. And I think that is something that the pharmaceutical companies should consider when they're doing the clinical trials, to have a faster accelerations on how to modify their clinical work. And that is my take from a patient's and from an entrepreneurship standpoint. Thank you.
So I think you found your first prospective billionaire, George. That sounds very interesting. So let me turn to Mene on this. I mean, AstraZeneca probably before your time learned some of this with Iressa, right? And maybe you're learning with
Absolutely,
Tagrisso. How can we get the industry to really analyze the outliers and to learn from the outliers?
Super responders or non-responders, I think we do, and we try to, and it's not often an easy pattern to find what makes a super responder, or a non-responder. And actually, immuno-oncology probably where I would say the most effort is being made to try and understand what is the difference between someone who responds to an anti-PD-1 or PD-L1 or doesn't, what makes a responder respond and then not respond. This is part of the challenges of cancer research and tumor heterogeneity, and ultimately our immune system as well, which we know operates very differently in different individuals. So it's great questions. If you find an answer for what distinguishes a super responder from a normal responder, I would love to know, because we haven't worked it out yet. But it's definitely an area of interest for us, and we do it across all of our areas again. You try and define who those rare patients are that respond above the norm or are cured of their disease, and you try and see what makes them different. And there's lots of omics you do around it, whether it's genomics or metabolomics or proteomics. Sorry?
Or the microbiome.
Or the microbiome, absolutely. There's all sorts of different to look at, but we haven't found any clear answers to that question yet.
But there are a couple of hundred immuno-oncology drugs in the pipeline, right? So, Rick, why wouldn't the NCI create a super responders consortium where the companies could pool this?
Harold Varmus did that when he was NCI director. He created I forget what it was called. It wasn't super responders, but some other word for it, the same thing. Collecting this from all, I think it was primarily the United States. You know, interestingly, as Mene said, it's been incredibly difficult with all that was thrown at the analysis of super responders. Very little has come. There are some examples where new mutations and new pathways have emerged from studying, I think, more non-responders or people that respond and then fail to and then stop responding. And the super responder phenomena remains something that people have looked at, but it hasn't yielded much.
Well, that's a mystery that somebody in the audience may pick as their career topic.
There's a good article. I remember there was a good article on some of these 17 super responders. I forget where, but it is there. I remember the number, but I don't remember.
Okay, well, if you Google 17 super responders, you might get it. Right?
But it's back to the economics of Rick's point about value-based, and I think we're seeing more and more this drive towards the demand for performance-based pricing. Not just in oncology, but in multiple segments, and that alters the risk calculus for companies.
Gives them the incentive to figure these sort of things out.
Well, the interesting thing with performance-based pricing, again, just to talk about it a little bit, is the difference between regulatory bodies and authorities wanting to get accelerated approvals, which means you're trying to push the drug through fast to benefit patients as soon as possible, versus the counter of the payers and the people that reimburse the medicine wanting to value-based pricing, which ultimately is overall survival versus progression-free survival, or cardiovascular outcome versus HbA1c reduction. And those two right now are diametrically opposed with each other. So this idea of real-world evidence ultimately being able to generate the real-world, the value-based pricing, which is, I think, the direction we're moving in. But we have to do that in a time frame that marries up with launching the drug, and right now it doesn't. And so this is one of the things I think that is currently, again, people are thinking about and thinking about how to do those real-world evidence studies much sooner to launch, or even before launch, with conditional approvals.
One of those areas where the Europeans have actually been, because we've been involved in this through CASMI, the adaptive pathways, but the payers are the ones who are last to turn up to the conversation.
Exactly.
Because they feel so stressed with today's costs. The idea of accepting something into earlier approval with less data, they immediately, particularly the Germans to be frank, but some of the other nationalities saying no thank you.
And the other dangerous term in this whole pricing thing is reference-based pricing, namely the belief that a given drug that all drugs in a claimed category with the same molecular target actually are equally efficacious.
That's a real problem.
It's a real problem. It killed the antibiotic industry.
That's right.
but because of sort of you come up with a third generation fluoroquinolone, they say, well, it's just a fluoroquinolone, right? And want to reference price it back to the original. And I think if we see the insidious creep of reference-based pricing into any therapeutic category, that's the end of R&D in that category.
I'm really worried about that for cell-based therapy right now. Yeah.
Is there anybody doing health economics in the group? Any thoughts? Any thoughts about this?
I only do health economics in China, so I don't know
Okay.
the platform. But I think we have did an analysis on the price and how much is it supposed to cost. And I think for a 3,000 RMB increase in drugs, but less toxicity will, 3,000 is equal to around 500 US does actually make a huge difference in patients' choice. But the request is that the toxicity has to drop down, and that's first. And the second we have done analysis on is what matters to the patients most when it comes to satisfaction. And the first thing is actually not on the cost, because all the drugs in China is expensive anyway. But the most important is how the doctors spend time with them, and that I think is the same for all diseases. We actually did the analysis on lung cancer only, but I think that is something that is very interesting, is that patients, the doctor's education is actually very important. It's probably more important than the cost itself, because they will understand the disease better, and I think that's something that we have done in the previous year.
You've just highlighted, I think, another significant barrier, which is shortage of time on the part of practicing physicians. So I think it takes us back, Rick, to your point, to get the information as simple as possible.
Yes.
Otherwise, doctors won't be able to absorb it. So other questions, thoughts, and proposals at the back?
Thank you. Hi, my name is Pedro, and I'm a PhD student here in Cambridge. And I was wondering, there's been a good amount of talk on not only the collection of data, but what we can actually do with it and the technology advances with it. I'd love to know more about what the public policy perspective of that is on not only data collection, but data sharing as well. So electronic health records differ, the legislation from country to country, region to region. So I'm wondering what kind of conversations are happening between the industry and legislators, not only for data that's collected in clinics and hospitals, but also personal devices, and how that's shared around. So how is the race between technology and public policy going about?
Well, that's a very interesting question, of course, and we are indeed, I think, in entering this era where the unbridled sharing of information is now being questioned, and we will have regulation. I have a personal point of view, which I'm sure that we can use as a debating point. I think that this will only be resolved when the patient themselves so-called owns and controls the flow of data, because otherwise you're into areas of trust. But there are some significant barriers. You can't actually, in Switzerland, you can't move electronic health record information from one canton to another. So if you happen to live in Basel, your data stays in Basel. So some of the great grand schemes that we may have about how to deduce information from all of this gets very difficult if we can't solve this problem. How do we address this problem?
Well, I think you've highlighted one, and I mean, clearly the pending European Data Directive has very significant implications for global integration of data and for each new excursion into new data categories. In the United States, the equivalent body would be the Office of the National Coordinator, and I think they've made very productive steps, even if somewhat hesitatingly at times. First of all was we had something which was called the vendor trap, that whichever major electronic medical record group, whether it be Epic or any of the others, basically set up their software systems to be completely incompatible with anyone else, so that you were trapped with that particular vendor. The Office of the National Coordinator has now essentially banned that, so at least that makes, at least for the first time, the prospect of facile interoperability, even assuming, as Rick said, you're capturing the right data, but at least there are now standards for facile interoperability. But I think you're absolutely right that the sort of the controversies which are now beginning to emerge, courtesy of Facebook, and they're not alone in what has come to be known colloquially as the techlash, the backlash against this type of technology. I think we've only seen the tip of the iceberg here, but the question of how far people are willing, I mean, it's always been stunning to me how, nominally we all pay homage to the need to protect healthcare data, and then you look at what's given away on Friday night after students have been in the bars. Not only do employers look at it now in terms of what did that person reveal after their Friday evening, then you look at all the other stuff. And there was a recent, in the United States, a reporter printed out her Facebook information, and she gave up after 2 hours of printing this out, and the stack of paper was this high, going back to having data from sort of 7 to 8 years ago about telephone numbers she called that she had no recall of actually calling until she went back in. So I think an interesting one we talked about at dinner last night is this one of George Church's latest initiatives in terms of Nebula. Rather than right now, groups like 23andMe and Ancestry and so forth will give you your data, but you don't have a control of that data because that's then sold on to other companies to utilize that data. Nebula is attempting to create a new model whereby you would actually be given a Bitcoin framework for your genomic data, and then if AstraZeneca or Pfizer or someone else wanted to use that data, then you have control of that data to say whether or not you want to actually release that, and if you do, then you get some presumably millionth of a Bitcoin or something, given the fact there's only 21 million of them going to be available. So that's at least the first time where you can see something that is being monetized as a consequence of owning your own personal data.
So Anu, is that part of your future business model?
Yeah, so I think I think the idea really is that I think consumers don't mind sharing their data as long as it's being used in the right direction, right? So if for instance, if my mutations are going to help, say, 3 generations down, I don't think I have a problem with that. I think what consumers are most worried about is saying, am I being sold for a higher insurance policy? Am I being sold for something else? Am I being sold for being a target for ads for something else?
As
right?
Zuckerberg said in front of Congress, right? That's how we get people.
So I think one thing is that clearly, I think from a security point of view, I mean, there is technology like blockchain and others that will be able to do that, and I think some companies are already doing it, and I think most companies will end up in that space, including ours, right? Because I think you will make sure that you give the comfort to the consumer that that's what you're doing with their data, right? So for instance, I think we take consent from consumers saying that, are you willing to share your anonymized data? And I think the anonymized is the key, but it's also the fact that you want to make sure that the consumer knows if that has been tampered with.
Do you think there is anonymized data?
I think there is.
No.
Not ultimately.
I mean, that way I think if
you can do your best, but somebody can find it.
And I must say, as we've seen with Facebook, getting consumers to say, you have my permission is meaningless.
No, but I'm saying that if you take, I'm not saying, I think I can get more information from Twitter and Facebook than someone can get from the genome, if I just gave them an anonymized genome data set. The problem is if you start to marry those together, and then you are able to make out, then it's a problem.
See, and I think that it's something I think, despite all this idea that, again, it goes back to the more data and everything, and maybe we can look at how you're using Fitbit and all this stuff. I think we'd be very well advised to make sure that we profoundly separate health data. I don't mean, just your personal health data. This whole world that we're talking about data for the benefit of health, and that actually we don't mix it with anything that's commercial. Even though you can write down things that just imagine how much health stuff I can pull out of Twitter. You can imagine all this stuff. By the way, I've looked at a lot of stuff. It's unbelievably noisy. Yes, you can publish an anecdotal paper, but when you apply that sort of behavioral stuff to the types of rules of rigor and specificity and signal to noise that we really want in medicine, I actually think it may be a lot less useful than we think. But whether it is or not, I think the danger of us mixing consumer data, advertising-related data with this precision medicine revolution is going to get us in trouble. And even if you imagine how wonderful it would be to have all possible streams of data coming together, it worries me.
No, and I suspect it worries most people here.
You get
actually.
to the Asimov's Gaia, right? The mind of the, if you think about it that way, then you know everything, everywhere that is going on.
Yes, Gaia knows everything.
Yes.
But Mene, have you had any patient call you up, send you an email saying, I'd like my data from that clinical trial that I was a subject in?
No, not personally. I'm sure we have had patients, particularly cancer patients, ask us for the genetic data when it comes to their tumour samples that we'll have sequenced.
What is the normal industry response to that?
Oh, I think we would give it to them because ultimately it's their data. I mean, everyone would be consented before the trial in terms of being able to use their genome or whatever data we're collecting for further studies. That's the sort of the routine now for any of our clinical studies. We keep our data sets separate though, so we would never try to integrate our Chinese genomic data with our US data, with our Finnish data. What we are able to do is use it all by enabling it to interact with each other, but we don't ever move it from one place to the other. So I actually think the idea that you have to create all of these completely integrated, ubiquitous data sets is not right. They will all remain independent of each other. What you have to create is the architecture that enables you to interrogate them all together. And that is quite distinct. So I think in that regard, because the countries are going to have different rules and regulations. China will be different to Ireland, which will be different to the US.
But there are some interesting national security issues which are starting to be raised now, and that is the fact that if you look at, say, the Carbon IX consortium out of China, in terms of the roll-up dimension of a number of relationships with US companies doing genome profiling, a number of questions are beginning to be raised as to what is the relevance of that when there is no linkage back to a commercial outlet in China, but nonetheless you're gaining profound information about a population.
So any lawyers in training?
My dog would bite them.
That's a pity, but any of your friends who are lawyers, you might want to just replay some of this debate because you can hear very clearly the need for proper regulation, thoughtful regulation, not over-regulation. So the next question or comment.
I'm Menelas. I'm working on engineering the potential of anti-cancer in food using traditional fermentation. And this is related to food, and it's piggybacking on Professor Richard Klausner's statement. It's very interesting as well, asymptomatic detection. And it might change our perspective here because we're talking about personalized medicine, and it's mostly related to medicines, it's to treat symptoms. But if asymptomatic, maybe it's more to preventive measures, and maybe it's related to diet to prevent this instead of medicine. And now we're talking about nutraceuticals, the mixture of pharmaceutical and food and nutrition. So it's very interesting. I would like to hear your comments on where are we now in this regard.
So a prescription for broccoli or something. When early stage disease is detected, will physicians get into nutrition and so on?
Well, let me just clarify something, is that asymptomatic is not the same as prevention. Asymptomatic these are diagnostics. I think the issue of prevention is much more complex than people like to talk about. The idea that it's always better to prevent. It's not totally clear to me. Why is it not totally clear to me? The intervention with individuals who do not actually have a disease, who has some probability, most of which we don't understand, all the stochastic events that go after saying at a certain point you have an 18% probability over the next 60 years to develop melanoma. What do you do with that? So I must say, I'm really focusing not on prevention. Prevention is hard because the requirement for prevention is almost zero toxicity because you're treating lots of people who don't need to be treated.
But that's true of the whole of medicine.
No,
Right?
but
If
I
you
mean-
look at lipid lowering, blood pressure, we're constantly trying to improve probabilities rather
But
than
those
get
are
Right.
risks.
But it's all about
yeah.
figuring out risk factors. Specifically about the blood test and the asymptomatic, I just want to clarify that asymptomatic is not about a predisposition. It is about the fact that you have something, it's just that it hasn't come to anyone's attention or no one's made a diagnosis. And in fact, the issue can be thought of, instead of early detection, which is one way, actually just the value of accelerated diagnosis. And that's a whole interesting question.
And the value here is huge because, it is important we talk about why don't we have more cures. The best way of curing cancer or heart failure or COPD is catching it early enough, right, that actually the therapeutic could then have its impact.
Exactly.
If you're treating, 80 or 90% of cancers in the UK are first diagnosed in the emergency room. If you could diagnose the cancer before it's metastatic, so that then you can either excise it or treat it, enable your immune system to attack it because it's not as bulky, not as not spread throughout, not so immunosuppressed. It basically then gets you to cure much more often than we can today. If I give you an analogy in Alzheimer's disease, where people right now are still trying to treat in what we're calling early AD, mild Alzheimer's disease, patients that have been diagnosed with what is like to be Alzheimer's disease but are not in the mild to moderate, that's still probably too late. They probably still have too much amyloid in their brains, they probably have too much neurodegeneration, and the challenge becomes if you start going a lot earlier where patients are asymptomatic, what will they tolerate in terms of side effects? Yeah. It becomes a very, very difficult thing to do. And companies are trying to do it, but it becomes hugely challenging in terms of the risk-benefit. Because if you're treating someone 10 years before they get a disease and their quality of life is excellent, what will they tolerate in terms of quality of life reduction to prevent them getting something in 10 years' time? Very difficult conversation. And the regulators, that's how
it goes to the broader challenge of who has responsibility, because
yes.
the length of time and the large ends that you need to undertake studies of this kind for meaningful endpoints.
Yes.
This should be where public health,
agree completely,
in areas which we've seen, so whether it be tobacco,
Studies,
seatbelts, or
yes.
whatever,
Yes.
those are issues which could be undertaken at the governmental level as a public health initiative. Right. It's extremely difficult if you're running a commercial organization to actually ever see the likelihood of getting the meaningful return from a large-scale preventative study at the present time. You could always argue the converse of that, that certainly once there was at least a focus on modulation of blood lipids, then the whole HMG-CoA reductase story with the statins became a very commercially gigantic market, but it has had preventative dimension, but it did not really arise from starting those drugs from the beginning. It required the Framingham study and other things to be able to permit you to do it.
Now we have about 10 minutes left, which is time, I think, for meaningful answers to about a couple of questions. There's a very there's a gentleman there with a hand further up than anybody else's, which gives you a bit of a clue, really.
My name is Holman. I'm doing my PhD out of the U.S. on translational biomedical sciences and computer science. So I actually wanted to be PhD out of medical school, or computer science school. I just want to take the conversation back to the first question, which was how many of us were doing data science versus clinical sciences. And I wanted to know if there's been any discussion around getting data scientists more involved in the clinical pipeline.
Yeah.
So there's this discussion around how do you take clinicians and train them to data scientists. We keep saying precision medicine, but we have medicine part with clinicians. Why aren't the data scientists part of the clinical paradigm? Much the same way we have pharmacists who are part of that, to bring that chemistry back to actual clinical paradigm.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Rohan. I'm an undergraduate student at Poste University. My question relates to Dr. Menelas and Dr. Richard. The use of multi-genomics or multi-omics in diagnosis and diagnostic tools, the instruments that you have been describing have largely just been genomic sequencing. But how do we understand the information at the proteomic, at the metabolic level, as well, especially when drugs like your CAR-T therapy, CD19, involves the receptor being there and being present? and the corresponding target can be present at different levels, and that can change over time. Where do you see this going in the future, and how do you think we can create diagnostics at that level?
So two kind of related questions, actually. I mean, how do we get data science into this, and how does that data science capability integrate meaningfully, back to your point, not adding everything up, but meaningfully into clinical decision making? Who wants? George, do you want to start?
There are multiple avenues, of course. The first is the fact that we have a massive shortage. But I mean, just as we have MD, PhD programs, MD, JD programs now, I wouldn't encourage the latter, but nonetheless,
I would from the previous discussion.
But humor aside, so we actually have an MD, PhD program in which the PhD is in data science. I think you're going to see that proliferate. There are programs at Harvard, Duke, and Stanford now where data science is linked to the MD, PhD program. Many schools of computer science now really look to healthcare as a major outlet. You're seeing Apple, Google, and Microsoft starting to believe that they can come into this space. I think it's going to be a tougher road for them to hoe than they may actually think, but nonetheless, they're coming in with enormous data analytical capabilities and a hugely sophisticated workforce. So I think we see multiple areas in which the inevitability, irrespective of whether the data is collected adequately or not, it's very much a target zone for people trained in the in data science. And if you're looking to divert into that area, it's certainly going to be a huge growth trajectory.
I agree.
But I agree completely. Don't you see this being driven by available technology very often? Back to the second question. So,
Yes.
And I'm going to point this at Anu because you've invested a lot of your recent career in genomics and what genomics can tell you. And there are people who are doing the same with proteomics, proteomic chips, the same huge growth in microbiomics. All of these data sets are meaningful. How do we get to a world where actually, back to Rick's point, the minimum insightful information gets deployed?
So, I mean, if you ask me honestly, I think if today everybody just wasn't obese, did not have tobacco, and did a few standard things, we would all be a healthier place. But that doesn't happen. I think we still are not at a point where people do the right things just because they're right. I think the challenge always is how do you get consumers to actually start doing something, and that usually happens when they realize that it's them and it's not the average. And I think that's where the big difference lies, right? How do you convince a consumer that they are also mortal, that they are also at risk for something? And I think that usually happens when you start nudging them. And one of the things we do while we are currently genomics focused is to be able to also take a lot of information when it comes to their family history, which I think today if you go to an average doctor, the doctor spends 2 minutes or 3 minutes with you and just looks at a problem and a solution. So I think the real change—
As opposed to the context.
Yes. So I think the real change will come when you can start empowering the consumer and say, this is you, and you can do this by making these changes, whether it's a nutrition-based, right? So whether it's your change in your diet or lifestyle, whether it's your interventions that you can actually do when it comes to screening. But it has to be something that you say the minimal thing actually should be about saying, convincing the consumer that they are being taken care of as individuals who might be different from the average or the mean or the median, right? And I think that part is the one where you have to drive home that, can you get the minimum number of data points, whether it's genomic and family history or genomics, family history, microbiome, and many other things. I think it's more about convincing the consumer that they are different and they are unique and that they can make a difference themselves.
So you've sort of slightly redefined the minimum data set in a way, the minimum data set that will alert the individual, maybe pre-symptomatically, back to an earlier conversation, to actually care and to feel they can make a difference. I mean, can you envisage the minimum data set that does that, Rick?
Well, let me turn it around a little bit to answer the question about measurement.
Please.
Our very reasonable obsession with genomics is because it's really important to biology, but also because it's an extremely accessible technology. I mean, and that's often what happens. Whatever tool you give to the scientific and research community that works really well, you use. Mene and I, probably unbeknownst to him, are sort of indirectly collaborating on a grand challenge project that is through the CRUK that I chair. And it's actually about cancer, asking the question, stepping back, how do we and how should we meaningfully describe a human tumor? You know that there's no single place you can go to anywhere and find a single, quote, Google map of a human tumor. And so this has been a grand challenge, and in that, it's one is associated with AZ, and it's actually thinking about how do we develop the quality of measurement of proteomics and metabolomics that, in essence, equal the quality and reproducibility and ease of getting sequence data. And it's really all about building new technologies. This is particularly what I'm talking about is housed out of the National Physics Lab here in the UK. And I'm going to be there tomorrow, and the data is extraordinary. I've seen it. It's without that, without the technology, we're stuck. I've sort of felt stuck looking through this pure genomic lens of cancer. And I've been seeing data emerge from this that says, wow, God, we missed all this other stuff. Right. There's a whole, we didn't know that the light spectrum was beyond visible, right? And suddenly you shine a light with a different wavelength, and you're seeing entirely different views of what determines whether something's going to be metastatic, for example, or not, which actually we have no hint of from lots of studies with RNA and DNA, and it may emerge from this totally new measurement in real time of metabolomics, which who knew? My point is, without measurement technology, we're going to always look under that lit lamppost. And what we still need to do, there's so much about the science of these diseases we don't know. We need to find entirely new lampposts. And we may find out that you don't need to do a total proteomic analysis or a total metabolomic. It's a way to discover, the 6 things you really want to measure. I mean, I have no idea. But I think that's where we still need to go.
And that's the key. I think you need to be. So I think routinely we're trying to measure as many things as we can to get us to what you want, which is the minimal amount of data we need to make a decision on something. And just one last piece around the data science, because I think there's a reason why the big data companies like Google and Apple and Facebook and others are struggling to make headways in healthcare. It's because they haven't got any healthcare experience. Exactly. And you need experience. You can't just hire someone out of grad school and say, make me a drug, or sort out how to work out the fundamentals of COPD. In the same way that in pharma and in biotech, we're struggling with getting enough data scientists. So I think this intersection between the physical and mathematical sciences and the life sciences is absolutely coming to a crunch now, and we're going to see more and more of these data scientists / biologists, data scientists / physicians, actually in all of our companies, leading us forwards into the next, I think, wave of innovation.
So we're out of time, but I think we're not out of challenges, right? And this probably wouldn't fit Rick's normal description of what a grand challenge looks like, but there clearly are grand challenges in education, educating clinicians, educating the research community. Grand challenges in understanding what makes, for example, a cancer go metastatic. How do you describe human tumors? Challenges in regulation, particularly regulation of data and data science itself, and probably some others I haven't written down here. So I want you to join me in thanking the panel for at least laying out some challenges for the generation in front of us.